There are certain concepts in the Bible that are easy to understand how they apply, while there are others that are not always as easily identifiable. Especially once you throw in the word spiritual, then it can sometimes get kind of foggy. I wanted to look at a verse today that I think will bring some clarity as to what it means to be spiritual. I want to use a concept in the Bible that I think will help to do that. Let's turn to Romans 12. Romans 12, verse 1. This to me has always been an interesting verse. It has a couple things about it that really stand out, but also a couple things that are easy to read over. However, the whole thing is both alluding to something current and referencing something from the past, yet all of it is relevant and meaningfully applicable. Before we get into it, it's important to understand that the book of Romans is largely divided into two sections. Romans 1 through 11 is theological. Paul is explaining concepts and truths. Then Romans 12 through 16 is where he begins the practical application, or Christian living, as we might say as well. So Romans 12 and verse 1 starts that section for us. But it's key to understand that the theology that Paul is explaining in the first 11 chapters has a lot to do specifically with Israel. There is especially a focus on this in chapters 9, 10, and 11, as Paul explains what is true Israel. But there's also major references to the law and sin in chapters 6, 7, and 8. All things that Jews would have been very familiar with. So this is where Paul's basis for his rationale is coming from, and is what gives us this verse in Romans 12 and verse 1. So with that, let's look at the verse. I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service. What exactly does Paul mean here when he calls us a living sacrifice? What does that even really look like? And how is it that he even can call us this? Well, these are questions we will answer, and in doing this, I believe this verse will make so much sense, and especially what this means spiritually, which is how Paul applies it. First, let's look at why he's using this idea of a sacrifice. Physical sacrifices, such as were done in Israel, we of course do not have to do because of the perfect and once-for-all sacrifice of Christ. But when Israel would bring these sacrifices to God, they were of course dead at the point they were offered to God. The animal was placed on the altar and at that point became holy to God. There were many different types of offerings that the Israelites had to do, but not all sacrifices were for sins. Burnt offerings, or as they're also known as sweet aroma offerings, were forms of worship to God and had nothing to do with sin. Offerings such as this, however, did not exactly originate with Israel. We know even Cain and Abel brought offerings before God. It's interesting, though, how these burnt offerings are viewed and what they're for. For example, when God told Abraham to take his only son Isaac and offer him as a burnt offering in Genesis 22, Abraham tells his servants that I and the boy will go over there and worship. Then later, Isaac asks, "Where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" indicating that he knew the burnt offering that they were going up to do was worshiping God. Sacrifice or offerings were a form with which to worship God. So as Paul calls us a living sacrifice, he's pulling from this background in Israel where they would have offered sacrifices, which, at least for burnt offerings, were intended for worship to God. Christ's sacrifice removes the necessity to offer animal sacrifices for sin. This we know. It also removes physical burnt offerings. However, we're not as detached from them as it might first seem. Let's go to 1 Peter chapter 2. 1 Peter 2. This will show where the connection to burnt offerings is, at least for us. Peter gives us something here that will start to frame how we can understand Paul's calling us a living sacrifice, and also where and how he's seeing this transition to something spiritual. 1 Peter 2, verse 4 and 5. So as you come to him, a living stone, rejected by men, but chosen and priceless in God's sight, you yourselves, as living stones, are built up as a spiritual house to be a holy priesthood and to offer spiritual sacrifices that are acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. Peter basically says here that you're part of a spiritual house so that you may be a holy priesthood and offer spiritual sacrifices. All these things Israel did physically, but now we are to do them spiritually. We probably understand pretty well that the reference to a spiritual house is today the church, the body of Christ. And we know, of course, from a few verses later here in this chapter of 1 Peter that we are called a royal priesthood. As Israel had a physical Levitical priesthood who offered sacrifices, we today are that spiritual priesthood to God. But guess what? Priests offer sacrifices. But as it says here, we are to offer spiritual sacrifices that are acceptable to God. Well, how do we do that? How do we offer spiritual sacrifices? Or do we even actually do that? Or is this something that is an interesting idea, but because it's spiritual, doesn't have any real, tangible, physical application for us? Or does it? This brings us to, I think, the cool part. I want to look at something that I think is really interesting. Let's have a look at Philippians 4. Philippians chapter 4. We've been looking at this concept of Paul telling us that we are living sacrifices. And from Peter, we get that this is something that is spiritual. But often understanding what is spiritual or how that's supposed to look like in real life is not always clear. So Philippians 4, starting at verse 17. Not that I seek the gift, but I seek the fruit that increases to your credit. I have received full payment and more. I am well supplied, having received from Epaphroditus the gifts you sent, a fragrant offering, a sacrifice acceptable and pleasing to God. Paul, in this verse, is actually talking about the financial assistance that he received from the Philippians to himself, which he calls the gifts. And notice he calls this money, this physical gift, a fragrant offering, a sacrifice acceptable and pleasing to God. No doubt we know where this language is from, the burnt offerings that were offered to God in the Old Testament, a sweet-smelling aroma acceptable to God. But notice Paul applies this once physical practice as something that is spiritual. You see, when Peter says we are to be a holy priesthood, offering spiritual sacrifices to God, this isn't some kind of mystical heavenly phenomenon that he's talking about. It's about us as God's people living righteously and doing good to one another in love, for this is pleasing to God. The spiritual sacrifices that we offer are actually our works, our deeds, our loving our brethren. This is what we offer up to God. They are physical acts, but they are done from a spiritual foundation. But, we might be scratching our heads a bit and say, well, yeah, but they're still physical. So why are they considered spiritual? Well, let's go to John 4, John chapter 4. We must remember, at the end of the day, we are physical, but we seek a God who is spiritual. We have the mind of Christ, the Holy Spirit in us, enabling us to do these things and understand them. So John 4, verse 23, this is where Jesus is talking to the woman at the well. Verse 23, but the hour is coming and is now here, when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For the Father is seeking such people to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship him in spirit and truth. So this is why these things, while we may do them as physical acts, they are spiritual in nature. because we seek to please God. And we know loving your neighbor is loving God. Even though the act may be physical, the foundation of it is spiritual. Otherwise, we would not be a holy priesthood. There's one last thing I want to look at. Let's turn back to our verse in Romans 12. I've always read this last line in Romans 12, verse 1, where it says, which is your reasonable service, so as it reads in the New King James, as something like Paul concludes, saying, you should do these things because that's what's expected. It's reasonable. It's not God asking anything special or dramatic of you. It's your reasonable service that you should do in response. Kind of like it's your obligation to do this. This is more or less how I've understood this line. And while this is still technically valid, as it turns out, it's not at all what it means. First of all, the word for reasonable here doesn't necessarily mean what we might read it as, in that it's reasonable, or it's normal, or it's nothing unusual. The word in Greek is logikos, from where we get our word logical. It's only used twice in the New Testament, this verse, Romans 12, and interestingly, somewhere where we have already been, 1 Peter 2. In 1 Peter 2, verse 2, this same word is translated as spiritual, where we're told to long for the pure spiritual milk, and by it we grow into salvation. But that's not all. The second word in the phrase, service, so is your reasonable service, this word service in Greek is latreia, and it's always used to refer to specifically religious service, or more precisely, worship to God. If you look at almost every other translation that is not the New King James or King James, or a translation that follow those two very closely, and even some that do actually, they almost all translate the phrase reasonable service as spiritual worship, or something very similar to that. Remember how I mentioned that in Israel, and even prior, such as in the days of Abraham, offering a sacrifice to God was a form of worship. If Paul is saying in Romans 12 that, I beseech you therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship, then this aligns very well with the idea of a living sacrifice, which is you presenting your body, that is your members, so your hands, feet, eyes, mouth, etc., as instruments of righteousness, by doing good works, which are sweet-smelling sacrifices to God. And this is your spiritual worship to Him. It is spiritual because the works done, while physical, are spiritual in nature. And worship because we are a priesthood with whom God is seeking from us these sacrifices, which is a form of worship to God. Because we are a holy priesthood and we are to offer spiritual sacrifices, we do this every day when we do good to our fellow man. This is us being spiritual. This is also being a living sacrifice, because of course we are alive as opposed to dead, as opposed to a dead sacrifice, as in the Old Testament, and the sacrifice that we are to be offering to God are our good works that we do for others. A living sacrifice, then, is someone who is alive towards God and who continually lives to offer these sacrifices in the form of obedience and righteous acts before Him. So this is an example of how it is that we do things that are spiritual, even when it only may seem physical, because we must worship God in spirit and in truth. And in doing these things, this is what He means when He calls us a living sacrifice.